Queria dar boas-vindas a todos os presentes em nome da UFBA. Esse evento é um evento especial por fazer parte do Seminário Internacional Marx, a Criação Destruidora, mas também é parte do Café Científico UFBA, que é um evento de popularização da ciência promovido pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ensino, Filosofia e História das Ciências da UFBA e da UFES e pela Livraria LDM Multicampi e apoiado pela Pró-Reitoria de Extensão da UFBA. E o objetivo do evento é popularização da ciência, ou seja, discutir com a sociedade geral desenvolvimentos recentes nas mais variadas ciências e seus impactos sociais. A gente gostaria muito de agradecer ao professor João Carlos Salles por ter intermediado o contato com a Boitempo e a constituição desse evento. Agradecer à professora Dulce Aquino pelo apoio durante a sugestão como Pró-Reitora de Extensão da UFBA. Queria registrar a presença da Pró-Reitora de Extensão atual, professora Blandina Viana, e gostaria de convidar o Arthur Renzo da Boitempo para dar mais umas palavrinhas com vocês.
Boa tarde. Queria agradecer primeiro a presença de todos, em nome da editora Boitempo, agradecer também todo o pessoal que está ajudando a gente a organizar isso, o pessoal da UFBA, e quero chamar o professor Jorge de Almeida. Ele vai fazer uma pequena apresentação do professor para vocês, o perfil dele, e em seguida ele vai abrir para o debate com uma questão para o professor. Jorge.
Boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a todas e todos. Boa tarde, professor David Harvey. Agradeço a honra de estar aqui presente, a convite da Pró-Reitoria de Extensão da UFBA, do PPG de Ensino, Filosofia, História e Ciências da UFBA e da UFES, a editora Boitempo, a Livraria LDM e a Fundação Lauro Campos. É com uma satisfação muito grande que a gente traz aqui essa apresentação ao professor David Harvey, professor de Geografia e também de Antropologia, no Centro de Pós-Graduação da Universidade da cidade de Nova York, diretor do Centro de Cultura Local e Política, autor de vários livros, e que tem ensinado o Kapital de Karl Marx há mais de 40 anos. Conheci David Harvey por escrito, quando iniciava meu mestrado, num ambiente marcado por concepções de mundo fortemente influenciadas pelo pós-modernismo e o liberalismo, e onde a principal disciplina obrigatória do curso tinha como tema central a chamada pós-modernidade. Numa situação de relativo isolamento intelectual e político, o seu livro, hoje um clássico, A Condição Pós-Moderna, foi o encontro de um parceiro que passei a usar como referência para a compreensão crítica da sociabilidade contemporânea e como recurso nas discussões. De lá para cá, minha simpatia pelo nosso convidado especial de hoje só aumentou, mesmo nem sempre concordando com todos os seus argumentos e conclusões. Antes de tudo, por ser um autor crítico e criativo, cuja leitura nos estimula a pensar. Um intelectual que pensa globalmente, construindo universalizações e abstrações, mas sem tirar os pés da realidade, que é, ao mesmo tempo, uma realidade totalizante e composta de realidades concretas diversas, histórica e geograficamente situadas. Portanto, sua referência teórico-filosófica, metodológica, é um materialismo histórico vivo, onde o combinado histórico-geográfico, que é uma marca própria do pensamento de David Harvey, não aparece no sentido de uma revisão dos conceitos-chave da obra marxiana. Ao contrário, se propõe a enriquecer a própria ideia de histórico que está presente no pensamento de Marx e Engels, no qual a dimensão espaço-temporal tem uma força significativa, e onde a ideia de que tanto as evoluções conflituosas dentro de um mesmo modo de produção, quanto os confrontos sociais e políticos revolucionários são processos desiguais e, de algum modo, combinados, histórico e geográficos, questões que devem estar presentes para uma compreensão materialista dialética da vida. Assim, compreendendo a profundidade da obra marxiana, nosso autor não a concebe de modo dogmático. Por outro lado, demarca espaço com a concepção superficial da compressão espaço-temporal presente no discurso pós-modernista, ligeiro e volúvel, que separa o particular do geral, impedindo uma compreensão da totalidade dos objetos de estudo e, portanto, dificultando um entendimento mais objetivo das relações humanas e da humanidade com a natureza. A preocupação principal de David Harvey nos últimos anos vem sendo a crise do capitalismo e, neste sentido, suas obras mais recentes, como o Novo Imperialismo, de 2003, Neoliberalismo, História e Implicações, de 2005, O Enigma do Kapital, de 2010, são produções articuladas e que, certamente, procuram desenvolver, aprofundar e atualizar ideias já presentes em Os Limites do Capital, de 82, e, de algum modo, também Espaços de Esperança, de 2000, onde, ao lado da crítica do liberalismo e do uso do termo globalização, que passou a ser usado como maneira de tornar positivo um processo que seria melhor definido como imperialismo, continua tratando de temas da sociabilidade que se entrelaçam com as preocupações presentes em a condição pós-moderna. Harvey tem dado cursos sobre o capital durante 40 anos e a própria descrição que ele faz em seu livro Espaços de Esperança sobre isto, mostra como é duro ser marxista na auto-intitulada mais importante democracia do mundo, os Estados Unidos da América, mesmo depois do macartismo ter deixado de existir formalmente naquele país. Diz ele sobre um dos cursos que implementou, abre aspas, disfarcei o nome do curso, costumava dá-lo à noite e concedi créditos de atividade para quem não queria mencioná-lo no histórico escolar. Mais tarde, soube de alguém dos altos escalões administrativos que, como o curso era do programa de Geografia e tinha o nome de Reading Kapital, levou quase uma década para que alguém percebesse que seu tópico era Marx. Como por motivo do tempo, nosso tempo foi cortado, eu vou dar um salto mortal e falar um pouco de Salvador e como isso estaria de alguma forma relacionado com os objetivos, os objetos principais de estudo de Harvey hoje. Harvey esteve aqui em Salvador na década dos anos 70. Foi uma década de uma das maiores intervenções privatizantes do Estado na sua destruição criativa na cidade da Bahia. Grandes obras romperam os vales e as matas da cidade, reconfigurando profundamente a vida urbana em todos os sentidos das 7 esferas que ele destaca existentes na sociedade. Você volta hoje aqui, Harvey. O estádio da Fonte Nova, construído em 1970, foi implodido. O estádio da Fonte Nova, duplicado em 1970, foi implodido e, em seu lugar, construído uma nova arena multiuso para a Copa do Mundo de 14, que terá um custo estimado de 700 milhões de dólares, pagos pelo Estado e entregue para a administração privada. Como em 70, estão em curso grandes intervenções urbanas. Quebraram a lei de uso do solo na orla marítima e no que nos resta de Mata Atlântica, para viabilizar grandes construções, avenidas, inúmeros viadutos para automóveis, linha de metrô e uma ponte para a ilha de Itaparica, que pretende ser a maior do Brasil. Por exemplo, uma das questões mais polêmicas na cidade, hoje, é o metrô de Salvador, onde a linha prevista originalmente para atender em conexão com o trem 2 dos maiores bairros de concentração popular, será substituída por uma linha para a Avenida Paralela, no sentido de favorecer o capital imobiliário, grandes shopping centers e construtoras. Como regra geral, não posso deixar de registrar que os professores e pesquisadores de nossa universidade sobre a questão urbana têm se colocado em oposição a estas políticas. Destaco, entre elas, a que será chamada Avenida 29 de Março, mais um instrumento de despossessão bem atual e típico a serviço do capital, em todas as suas dimensões, que tem em seu nome a data da imposição do Estado opressor português no Brasil, através de Tomé de Souza e Garcia Dávila, em 1549. Uma homenagem meio absurda, mas pensando bem, este nome é bem adequado, pois o objetivo e a função desta avenida é essencialmente o mesmo do português Tomé de Souza há 464 anos atrás. Para isto, o Estado, apesar das disputas de grupo entre seus dirigentes, está unido em todos os níveis, governos federal, estadual e municipal. Mas Salvador, professor David Harvey, também, como gostamos aqui de dizer, além de ser uma confusão como a sua querida Baltimore, é também uma cidade bela e uma cidade de resistência. Desde os povos indígenas, passando pela luta dos escravos, que continua ainda hoje, contra o racismo ou a resistência de quilombos, como o de Rio dos Macacos, que resiste à tentativa de expulsão do Estado brasileiro através da Marinha. Que teve a conspiração dos alfaiates, o mais radical projeto de revolução social no Brasil, no século XIX, e a luta contra a ditadura. Além de tantas lutas contemporâneas de trabalhadores e trabalhadoras, da juventude, mulheres, movimento LGBT, ambientalista e outros movimentos populares, como os dos sem-teto. Dentro, claro, e de alguma maneira relacionados às suas preocupações como movimentos alternativos, contestatórios e contra-hegemônicos. Para finalizar, caro David Harvey, lembramos que há luta e resistência também nessa universidade. Este mesmo edifício já foi ocupado muitas vezes e recentemente palco de alguma das grandes assembleias, as maiores da história desta universidade, no ano passado, em 2012. Numa histórica greve nacional que envolveu professores, servidores, administrativos e estudantes, mostrando que em nossa universidade há vida, e pela própria recepção que você está tendo aqui hoje, um crescimento de espaço para uma leitura crítica da realidade e uma vontade de transformação social e política. Por tudo isso, com certeza sua conferência e sua obra vão nos ajudar a compreender melhor nossa realidade para agir transformadoramente nela. Seja, portanto, muito bem-vindo à Universidade Federal da Bahia e à capital da resistência, como chamamos nossa querida Salvador.
Antes de passar a palavra ao professor Harvey, eu só queria ressaltar algumas questões de ordem prática. Ao final da conferência, haverá uma breve sessão de perguntas e respostas. Queria pedir para vocês encaminharem suas questões por escrita para o pessoal da organização. E as questões vão ser divididas em 2 blocos temáticos, por mim e pelo Jorge. As questões vão ser divididas em 2 blocos temáticos, por mim e pelo Jorge. E enquanto a gente faz isso, o Harvey vai responder às provocações do professor.
Okay, it's my turn. The only problem I have, this is a wonderful event, and I'm very, very pleased to be here after nearly 40 years since I've been here. And your city has indeed changed a lot, and in some ways, I suppose, when you drive past all of the shopping malls and all the high-rise buildings coming from the airport, I think that you can see that this is a capitalist transformation, not necessarily a popular transformation. The only sense of discomfort I have is I feel like I'm sitting on a throne. And since I hate monarchy, I expect an assassin's bullet any minute. I think that, I don't know what, is this okay? I think what I want to do is to try to talk a little bit about the consequences of this event, which is I'll use this. Yeah, I'll use this. Okay. I really wanted to talk about the consequences of this double event, which is, in my view, both hopeful and also positive. And since we don't have many positive and hopeful events to talk about these days, I hope you'll join with me in celebrating it. What we're celebrating is the publication of a new translation of Marx's Kapital, Volume 1 by Boitempo. Now, I don't read Portuguese, but I am reliably informed that this translation is far, far superior to that which went before, and it has the most updated versions of Kapital, including a great deal of information about where the text came from. So this is, if you like, a very positive development. It's accompanied by the hopeful thought that you might actually read it and learn from it. And from that perspective, you have a little help, I hope, from me with the translation of my own companion to Marx's Kapital under the title of Para Entender or Kapital. This book that I wrote was a transcription of a series of lectures which are available free on the web, if you so wish. I gather that there are some of the lectures now have Portuguese subtitles, so that you can use those, or you can use this in order to get through this. The other thing I would say to you that might be a glimmer of hope to you if you're younger is that I actually didn't start reading Marx until I was 35 years old. And now I am a little bit of an expert on the topic. So if you start a few years earlier than me, you'll be far ahead of me by the time you get to my age. I started reading it for one very simple reason, not because I was born a Marxist or had parents who were Marxists or because I was in a political party that was Marxist. I started reading it just as looking for some explanations that I couldn't find elsewhere. I had moved from Britain to the United States in 1969. Throughout the 1960s, there had been in the United States a whole series of urban rebellions, uprisings in Detroit, in Los Angeles, New York, and in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, something like 120 cities in the United States experienced serious unrest. The city of Baltimore, to which I went, had a large chunk of it was burned down. Tanks had been sent into the city to control a restive population. There had, in fact, been a whole series then of urban rebellions. And as often happens, there are two responses to events of this kind. One was a sort of right-wing, repressive, let's just get the military and put everybody in jail response. And the other was, well, we should try to use the police to stop the situation, to calm the situation, but we should really try to find out why these rebellions have been happening. And I became involved, therefore, in a research effort trying to figure out how and why these cities had erupted in the violent ways they had. In the process, I brought to bear on this research effort a whole set of skills in the social sciences and in statistical analysis and all the rest of it, which were supposed to give me the tools to understand what had happened and why. And I increasingly found these tools were completely useless, that they really didn't help at all. In fact, they were a hindrance rather than a help. So I started looking around for some other way to think about the problem. And somebody said to me, well, maybe you should read Karl Marx. So I thought, well, okay, I'm an academic, I'm curious, let me go read Karl Marx. And there were some graduate students who thought it was a good idea, so we sat down, about 10 of us, and we tried on our own, without any instruction, to read this book. The only conclusion we came to at the end of the year, having spent the year reading the book, was that we had not understood a thing. We hadn't the faintest idea what this was all about. Now, there are two things you can do with that. You can either throw the book away, or you can say, well, maybe I'll do it again and see what happens. So we did it again the following year, and the second time through, it really began to make a lot of sense. But a lot of sense in its own terms. In its own terms were the conditions prevailing mainly in England in Marx's lifetime in the 1850s and the 1860s. A lot of what is said in Volume 1 of Capital didn't seem to fit very well with a world where there was a strong welfare state, where the state was intervening in the economy, where it was not purely competitive capitalism, it was monopoly capitalism. In other words, the world that we were living in was not the same world that Marx described. And so there was some difficulty in taking Marx's ideas and using them to come to directly understand what was going on in the society around us. One thing I can assure you of right now is that that problem does not exist today. Because over the last 30 or 40 years of neoliberalism, we have gone back to that world that Marx described. So that actually when you read this book now, you get recognition page after page after page. And this I can tell you from teaching it for 40 years. When I first taught it, I was trying to explain to people, well, it doesn't quite fit, but you know, let's think more deeply about how we can use some of the ideas. Now I don't have to make that argument at all. I can take descriptions of the labor processes in China, in Bangladesh, and I can put them in Marx's chapter on the working day where he describes the conditions of labor in the English working class, and you wouldn't know the difference. You could take descriptions of what it's like in the Bangladesh factory producing clothing for Walmart and the other major stores in the United States, where some 200 people died because they locked the doors and the fire just spread like crazy. Those are the sorts of things that are mentioned in Kapital Volume 1, and those are the things that are occurring around us today. But back then, it was still a little bit difficult to make the argument that this work made sense. But I got a great deal of encouragement in my understanding of Marx and of its relevance from a very strange source. I was working a lot on the condition of housing in Baltimore in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I was collecting a lot of information. I was talking about what was going on through housing finance, what was going on through landlordism, what was going on through tenants' movements and public housing. I was talking about all of these things. I was talking about federal public policies. And I had to write a big report and submit this report to the bankers, to the landlords, to the federal officials and the city officials. And I started the report by saying, well, you really need to think about housing from two perspectives. One is you have to think about housing as a use value. What is it useful for? And you can think about all sorts of things that a house is used for shelter, for constructing an effective family life, for creating social relations, for securing a certain privacy. So housing has a set of use values which are foundational for people's daily living. And I said, but the other side of it is housing has an exchange value. That is, it takes a certain amount to build it, a certain amount to maintain it, a certain amount to gain access to it. So there are two systems at work here. One is a use value system and the other is an exchange value system. And the problem is that the exchange value system is organized in such a way as to not provide adequate use values to a large segment of the population. So the challenge for all of us is to think about a different structuring of the exchange value system to provide adequate use values to the mass of the population. And then we won't have riots in the streets because there's such lousy housing conditions. And I went through this analysis and went through this. And the bankers said, God, that's a great way to look at things. The landlord said, you know, we thought you were an economist and we're going to talk about demand and supply and all that kind of rubbish. This is a great way to think about it. The city authorities said, this is a great way to think about it. And then somebody said to me, where did you get it from? I did not dare say it is page 1 of Marx's Kapital, Volume 1. But it is. If I had said that, they probably would have all said, let's leave. There is a ghost in the room. Karl Marx is alive. Oh my God, he's going to kill us all. He's going to put us all in prison. So I never mentioned a word about where the whole idea came from. But they thought it was great. And I thought, you know, if Marx's basic category on the page 1 of Kapital makes so much sense to so many people so easily, when all of the economics textbooks don't make any sense whatsoever, then I'm going to stick with Marx, and I'm going to find out more about what Marx has to say. The second thing I found was that I had to write a lot about the finance and the financial system. And this was a complicated thing even back then, in 1970, 71. But in writing about it, I was aware that I had to answer a very, very simple but and even seemingly silly question. what is money? Now, I'm teaching a class on money this semester, and I asked all the students at the beginning, what is money? And nobody knew what to say. And I suspect a lot of you don't know what money is or how to think about it. So here is this strange situation in which we use something every day called money. We spend much of our lives striving to get it. Much of the rest of our lives is trying to dispose of it and get something else with it. We obsess about it. We lust after it. We get greedy about it, but we don't know what it is. Isn't this a strange situation? So how is money created? Who creates it? Where does it come from? And why does it flow around in the way it does? And in order to get at that, I decided, well, I have to go a little further than page 1 of Kapital. I have to go to the first 3 chapters. And there you learn something very interesting. What comes up is the idea that money is a claim upon social labor. That is, it's a claim upon social labor directly or the product of social labor. It's a claim. You get it, and then you claim your right by spending it. So it's a claim on social labor, which means that it is also a representation of social labor. Exchange value can't exist without a measure. You need something to measure it. And what you measure it with is money. Now, money is a peculiar kind of measure. In some respects, it's a bit like kilos and seconds and all other measures we have. But in other respects, there's something very odd about it. Because while it is like kilos and meters and so on, and it gives you a measure so that we can say this is measured as so many units of the measuring rod, which is money. But at the same time, the peculiarity is you can actually buy the measure. You can't buy meters, and you can't buy kilos. You can only buy kilos of potatoes or meters of cloth. You can't buy meters and you can't buy kilos. And you can't buy seconds. You can buy seconds of labor, but not seconds. But you can buy $100. And you pay for it with interest. So you actually can buy the measure of value. So there is a trading going on of the measure of value, which is very strange. So that the measure of value has a value, which is the interest rate. And you then have to ask the question, who sets the interest rate? And where does it come from? And why does it move in the way it does? Well, there's, again, a complicated answer to that, so I'm not going to try to give you the answer here right now. I may get into it later. But the point here is that money has these features, and as a representation, it is also a measure. So it's a representative measure of social labor. Now, the thing that's absolutely critical to understand is about representation, is that representations represent accurately in some things, but they invariably lie and mislead in others. I can say that to you because, being a geographer, I know about maps. maps are famous for being very accurate in some respects, but totally false in others. There is the whole problem of map projections. How do you take a globe and project it onto a flat surface? There is no one answer. And if your answer is accurate in terms of directions, it lies about areas, and it lies about shapes, and so on. And if it's accurate in terms of areas, it lies about directions. So we've all got this idea that when we look at the map, that Greenland is some huge, huge space. In fact, it's not anywhere near as huge as that in reality. It's just it looks that way because of the map projection. In other words, the map lies at the same time as it tells a certain truth. Money is exactly like that. It tells a certain truth, but it also lies. And one of the things that happens in the act of representation is that you represent the generality of social labor, usually and initially, in one particular commodity, gold, very often accompanied by silver, so it's sometimes bimetallic. So what you're saying is that social labor is represented by gold. But the thing about gold, which is different from social labor, is this. Social labor is a social relation. It therefore is immaterial. And it cannot easily be appropriated in a material way. But you can steal gold. You can mine gold. You can do all kinds of things with gold. So that the measure of value is a representation which has material qualities which can be appropriated by private persons, which I think is the crucial thing. That money is a measure which has a value which can be appropriated by private persons. Money is therefore the primary form of wealth. It is therefore the foundation of capitalist class wealth. And no wonder we lust for it. No wonder we struggle for it. No wonder we want always more of it. Because it is a form of social power which can be appropriated by private persons. At the same time, it can only be a form of social power appropriated by private persons because it lies, because it's false. That's what you learn from Marx's Capital. And it actually leads you straight into one of the other things you learn from chapter 1, which is the idea of fetishism. Fetishism is about the disguise, what it is that hides a reality. Marx argued the commodities hide their history. Therefore, the market hides what has been happening to people. We go into the supermarket, we take some money, which is a representation of social value, and as a private act, we appropriate the potatoes or the peppers or whatever, and we gain the commodity, we take it back home, and we make dinner. We know nothing about the social labor that the money represents. We know nothing about the social labor incorporated in the commodity we have purchased. We know nothing about the social relations of that labor. So that in effect, the transaction in the supermarket is a fetishistic transaction because it hides the reality that exists behind it. Now, I used to love to teach beginning geography class, because in the beginning geography class, I'd always start with the question, where did your breakfast come from? And it's very interesting. You should think about it. And you start watching, and you kind of go, you know, students say, well, you know, I got it from the deli or something. And you say, well, look, come on, where did the sugar come from? Well, I don't know. Well, let's find out where the sugar came from. And pretty soon you find yourself back down the chain in the Dominican Republic, in the sugarcane fields, with workers who are being paid a pittance, with actually direct producers who are paid not very much, and then the mill gets some. So you just suddenly see behind what's on your breakfast table a whole chain of activities, people, sometimes working in reasonably pleasant circumstances, in other cases, appalling circumstances. So I used to like to persist with this question of where did your breakfast come from? And I'd always get somebody in the third week or second week of this who would say, I did not have breakfast this morning. In which case I would then ask the question, well, let's talk about dinner last night. And this is, of course, precisely the point, that we would die if we did not actually rest upon this whole world of commodity production and commodity exchange, a world we know nothing about, a world with which we make transactions with the aid of this mysterious thing called money, and with the aid of these mysterious things called commodities. And what Marx tries to say is, it is the task of the analyst to de-fetishize what we are encountering, to get behind the surface appearance, to really think about what it is that's going on behind the market, beyond the supermarket, and really then ask ourselves, is this the kind of world we want to live in? And if we don't think this is the kind of world we want to live in, then maybe we should set about changing it. Changing it so that the exchange value system does not have the power that it has. Now, you may think this is all kind of a bit abstract. But if you look at the recent crisis, which broke out in 2008, and say, where did it break out and how? The crisis broke out in housing markets. So you ask yourself the question, let's think about the use value of housing and the exchange value of housing, and what has happened to that relationship between use values and exchange values historically. 400 years ago, exchange values were scarcely present in housing construction. People were building their own housing or having neighbors help them. A few commodities, maybe a saw, an axe, nails, hammers, but that was about it. Then what happens is that around the 17th and 18th centuries, housing starts to be built as a speculative commodity. That is, people build large tracts of housing and then sell them after they have been built. If you go to London, you'll see Georgian terraces, you'll see, which are built this way. Back-to-back housing for the working class built this way. So housing became a commodity, which was bought and sold in the market. But then about 100 years ago, people recognized that as a commodity, it had a long life, and that as an asset, its value could be maintained could perhaps even increase a little bit. And as a social pacification measure, the idea came up amongst the bourgeoisie, why don't we try to get workers as homeowners? Because, as it was said a little later, debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. Home ownership is a big defense of capitalism. Get part of the working class to be homeowners and they will not revolt. That was the thesis and the theory. And it picked up in the 1890s in Britain just a little bit. It became very strong in the 1930s. But in order for that to become very strong in the 1930s, you needed to create new financial institutions. You needed to modify the exchange value system. And that is when the 30-year mortgage came in, both in the United States and Britain. And the 30-year mortgage then allowed affluent elements within the working class to become homeowners. And as they became homeowners, they could aspire to becoming full owners of their homes after 30 years. And they could pass on some wealth to their children. This is a great capitalist idea. That segment of the working class, what were homeowners, typically did not vote in Britain for the Labour Party. They voted Conservative. So this was a way of creating a world of a certain sort. And of course, home ownership became a big item in the United States. One of the ways in which the United States got out of the Great Depression of the 1930s was through suburbanization, which meant home ownership for large segments of a white privileged working class, which therefore had to be paid enough to be able to buy the housing. And this was, if you like, the boom years of the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, based very much on the spread of home ownership and particularly the development of the US suburbs. And in many respects, that was what saved capitalism from depression. But about 30 years ago, the house started to have another kind of exchange value. That is, people started to realize that you could speculate in the housing value. That you could actually get a house now and have a high mortgage on it. You could then use that high mortgage and then sell your house at a very large capital gain and then buy another set of houses. And so people were buying like crazy. And after capital lost all of its possibilities of finding anywhere profitable to go and started to pour into housing markets, you suddenly find housing becomes the place where exchange value flows in a speculative boom. And then, of course, the crash comes. And through the crash, we get a wave of foreclosures, the result of which is that somewhere between 4 and 6 million people, nobody knows exactly how many, but between 4 and 6 million people lost their use values because of the way the exchange value system was working. In other words, I can give you the beginnings of an explanation of the last crisis simply by going back to those categories on page 1 of volume 1 of Capital. I can take it a little further when I get into the money stuff and start talking about fictitious capital. That is, capital which is being purchased as capital, which is then used to support housing speculation on values that are not realizable. So again, the monetary system contains a fiction. Not only is it fetishistic, it is also fictitious. So because money is supposed to represent social labor, but because of its form, it cannot do so accurately. It therefore becomes an instrument of self-destruction. So again, simply taking Marx's categories in the first 3 chapters of Capital, you can get a long way into explaining where the crisis came from. But you can also get a long way into the idea of a political project as to what an anti-capitalist politics must be about. If we see clearly from the analysis I've given, the problem is that exchange values are supposed to deliver use values and they fail, then we must actually start to diminish, if not ultimately abolish, the exchange value system. That is, we move towards a world which delivers use values to everybody. Use values so that people can have everybody can have a decent standard of life. And to hell with the exchange value stuff. Get the exchange value out of there. Now, we have been through 30 years now where we have been told that the most efficient and best way to gain all of those use values we desire is to liberate the exchange value process. Liberate the market. We've now privatized higher education in the United States. It's now all about exchange value, not use value. The same is true of healthcare. We don't provide the healthcare people need because the exchange value system cannot deliver it. So what does Obama do? He proposes a healthcare universal system which solidifies the exchange value dynamic, not the use value dynamic. Politically, if you are anti-capitalist, as I have become, then politically you have to commit yourself to saying, I am going to do everything I can to abolish the power of exchange value in society to dominate over the use value. You then go to the money side. It's clear that money has gone crazy. And Marx talks about this in the 3rd volume of Capital, when he's talking about the credit system, where he starts talking about it as the height of insanity. He talks about it as the height of craziness. And when you start to look at how the whole thing is structured, it is indeed structured in a way that is conducive to absolutely crazy decision-making. Marx sets up, in the 3rd volume of Capital, a very simple kind of model. There is social value, which is social labor. That is, the labor we do, which is meant to help others live their lives in a decent way. That's what social labor is. It's not the labor I do for myself, it's the labor I do for others. And not the labor I do within my family, but the labor I do for others. So there's social labor. And social labor is value. Value is represented by the money commodities, like gold, silver. And then gold and silver are not good when it comes to actually operating as a medium of exchange. I mean, if every time I bought something like this, I had to find a piece of gold to do it, I'd have to find tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of gold. Using gold for this sort of thing is impractical. So out of that came coins and paper monies and all the rest of it, which at one time were considered convertible into gold. It is still the case that British banknotes say, this bank promises to pay the bearer And it used to be that that promise meant you could redeem that note for gold. Right now, you can't redeem it for gold. All you can do is to exchange that note for another note issued by the Treasury. So the gold commodity has disappeared, and we get then all of these other forms of money which are regulated by banks, and in particular by the central bank. So Marx puts it this way. He says, commodities, value is the base of the system. The pivot above it is the gold commodity, and the pivot above that is the central bank, and then the pivot above that is the credit system. And Marx then looks at the relationships between these different levels within the financial system and says the following. He says each level is autonomous and independent, but subsumed under the requirements of the layer below. Now, when people first read that, they say, okay, that's a pretty nonsense statement. What on earth does it mean? I mean, how on earth can you interpret that? And I have a very simple analogy. I say, it's a bit like raising a teenager. Teenagers love to claim they're autonomous and independent. And they act that way until they get into trouble. When they come running home and say, please bail me out. This is exactly what populates the financial system. It's a bunch of irresponsible teenagers at various layers, with the most rambunctious and most irresponsible at the top, who consider themselves masters of the universe until they go bankrupt, until the system crashes, and then they come running home to mommy, daddy of the state and say, mommy, daddy, please, please bail us all out. Which, of course, is exactly what the central bank does, as any good parent does. So this is the structure, but it's a crazy structure, because the masters of the universe draw immense wealth out of this system. That's why they're in it. And if you go back to the housing crisis, what we see is that millions of people lost their assets. African Americans and Hispanics lost nearly 70% of their assets from 2007 through to 2012. 70% of the value of their assets just disappeared. The white population, only 28% disappeared. But this is still a hell of a lot of money that is stolen. It is what I call accumulation by dispossession. It is a form of accumulation based on robbery. And then you look at the quantities involved, and you see a parallel between the quantities that were lost there and the quantity that the Wall Street bankers were paying themselves just as bonuses. Now, I can't say and track the money going from there, say $40 billion going from there and $40 billion appearing here, and say it's the same money. I can't do that. But when there's 40 billion lost here and 40 billion gained there, the inference is there's some relation between the two. And it's pretty clear that the robbery, the daylight robbery that occurred in the financial system, in the housing market, played a very, very important role in giving huge amounts of personal wealth to the Wall Streeters, who then found their own financial institutions effectively bankrupt. They had to be bailed out by the Treasury, which means our money had to bail them out. Again, another form of robbery of the mass of the population. The most recent attempted example of this, if you followed it, was Cyprus. How to bail out the banks in Cyprus and bail out the bondholders of the banks in Cyprus. The idea was that actually some 7% of everybody's deposits should be just taken away. Even the Financial Times said this is daylight robbery of the banks. So we see a lot of that going on. Now, this is the monetary system we have constructed. We need a radical reconstruction of the monetary system. We need new forms of money. The one I favor most is one where money actually melts. Money oxidizes. See, the reason that gold and silver became the money commodities is that they're metals that don't oxidize. They maintain their qualities. They store value for a very, very long time. They're not even like iron, they don't rust. Money is supposed to retain its value over time. That is how the capitalist class stores its wealth. Let's suppose we displaced it with a form of money which disappeared after a certain point of time. Actually, there were forms of money of this sort that were invented in the 1930s, called stamped monies. John Maynard Keynes writes about them in one of these appendices. You'd have a bill that would be worth, say, $100, and it would be worth $100 for a month. And if you wanted to renew it, you had to pay $5 for it to be renewed at the end of the month. In other words, it was a negative interest rate on the bank. Result is, of course, that you either spent it or you started to lose money. If we had an oxidizable money, a money that melted away, then the wealth of the capitalist class would disappear very rapidly. Again, this is a kind of a new form of money which has a radically different way of operating. It does not prevent exchange. In fact, it encourages exchange, because you're stuck with a situation where if you use your money, then it's validated and you can keep on using it. If you do not use it, it disappears. So the use value of money is that it facilitates circulation. Now, these are the sorts of ideas that come out of Marx's critical perspective as he lays it out in Capital. These are the kinds of ideas that you start to encounter as you work through the text. But as you work through the text, there are a number of things I think you have to understand. That is, that Marx was not theorizing about everything. I make very clear to the students that Marx's Capital is not a book about capitalism. It is a book about capital, which is the economic engine which exists at the heart of capitalism. And that economic engine is about the production of capital, the production of commodities, and the reproduction of commodities and capital. And the rules embedded in that system, and how contradictory those rules are, and how those rules actually conflict and generate crises. So what Marx is after understanding why it is that the economic engine that powers capitalism is so crisis-prone. In order to understand that, he has to isolate the nature of that economic engine. And in isolating it, he, of course, excludes all kinds of important aspects of what capitalism is about and what capitalism has historically been about. I have many arguments with my colleagues at CUNY the arguments are often over the question of, well, why aren't you talking more about the racializing history of capitalism, the way in which race has been used in the history of capitalism? Why aren't you talking about patriarchy? Why aren't you talking about gender? And I say all of those elements are absolutely crucial if you're interested in the history of capitalism. And I'll be the first to support all of those struggles around the eradication of racism and gender discrimination, the liberty of lesbians, gays, and the like. I'm all in favor of that. But by working on those aspects, you still do not get a good understanding of how the economic engine of capital is working. And what I'm trying to do, and what Marx is trying to do, is to give you a good understanding of how the economic engine works and how it intersects with racialization and gender discrimination and the like. Again, if I go back to the recent crisis, you cannot get to a good explanation of what happened in the last crisis by starting from an analysis of racialization or gender discrimination, patriarchy. You cannot get there. What you can do is to recognize that the impacts were racialized, gendered, and the evidence for that is overwhelming. But the origins cannot be described in that way. That is, what Marx does is to look at that system which is producing value and surplus value, producing commodities and wealth. He's looking at that system and looking at the necessary components of it and why it is so crisis-prone. And why it is that if you object to the kind of society that has emerged around us, yes, indeed, there are struggles to be fought over civil rights, over sexual rights, over all of those issues. There are struggles to be fought over that, but you will not get rid of the foundational problems of a capitalist society until you really understand the nature of capital itself. And what Marx does so brilliantly, even in an abstract kind of way, what he does so brilliantly is to actually tell you what capital is like. And through the analysis, you realize what anti-capitalist struggle should be about. I've already said, well, the first contradiction between use value and exchange value leads me to say, let's diminish the power of exchange value. Let's validate as much as we can use value considerations, ultimately leading to a society that is based on the provision of use values with exchange values almost at a minimum. The second contradiction over money as a representation of social labor and a falsification. Cut down on the falsifications. Get rid of the fictions. Defetishize what money is about. Try to create a monetary form that just does the simple job of facilitating exchange and nothing more and nothing less, and certainly make it into a kind of monetary system that does not allow the building of massive concentrations of wealth of the sort that we see in the contemporary world. There's a third contradiction I haven't mentioned. It relates to the first two. You cannot have exchange value without having money. You cannot have either of them without having private property rights. But private property rights presume a certain relation to the state and the state apparatus. That contradiction between the state and private property has to be resolved. And the obvious way to resolve it is through a system of common property rights which are managed under collective administrative structures. In other words, abolish the private property state contradiction and replace it with common property rights, with, of course, money being a main form of the commons. These are the sorts of answers that start to come up politically. And to me, therefore, it is really foundational, if we're to understand the kind of society we live in, capitalism, that we come to terms with how that economic engine which powers it and which creates all of these problems, from those that I encountered in the Baltimore housing market, to the housing crash recently, to the problems that exist in education and healthcare and all of those areas, you start to see that it is the capitalist beast at the center, the beast that is capital, that really has to be confronted and dealt with. And therefore, politics has to orient itself around an alternative vision of a society that is built around completely different presuppositions than those which govern what capitalism is about. There is one final point. Capitalism historically has been very dynamic. It has been crisis-prone, but many people would argue, yes, it has, and yes, it's produced 2 world wars and all kinds of horrible things, but on the other hand, in aggregate, aren't we all better off right now than we would have been maybe 200 years ago? And I follow Marx in this and say, for the most part, I accept that we are better off in principle. We are living longer, not necessarily better, but living longer. There are other things that you can point to that are very positive about our current situation. But there are certain fatal contradictions. Capital cannot accumulate at a compound rate of growth forever. The data show that capital has been accumulating at the rate of 2.25% per year at compound since around 1800 or so. Compound growth rates produce a logistical, geometric growth rate. For a long time, you're like this, and then you go like this, and then you go like this. It's clear to me that since 1970, we've been at that inflection point where we're beginning to go like this. That's what I see as I come from the airport into the center here. What has happened since 1970 is a massive building boom, absorbing vast amounts of commodities, a lot of it wastefully, for a certain segment of the population, absorbing capital through an urbanization project, which is not about the creation of slums, but which is about the creation of a kind of a bourgeois paradise, if you can call a shopping mall a paradise. So we're at that inflection point. If we are here in 30 years' time, we will be even further into that inflection point. We will be on the heading point upwards. And people are saying the same thing about the environmental question. You can push the environment so far at a compound rate, but you get to a certain point where you start to do this. And a lot of the tracks that the environmentalists are producing are doing precisely that, looking at carbon emissions and the like. So we're headed into this period where, on the one hand, we have the greatest capacity for global affluence ever, and that we have to thank capital for. But we face a future where it is absolutely impossible that that can continue to be produced and reproduced in the same way. In other words, we have to think about a society that is not growing in aggregate. Not immediately, but sometime in the next 20, 30 years, we have to be really confronting the idea of a zero-growth society. And a zero-growth society is a non-capitalist society, because capitalism is inherently about growth. Capital must grow or die. And if it cannot continue to grow, it will die. And if we say we have to stop growth because we cannot accommodate more of it, then we have to kill capital. That is the kind of existential choice that we're headed into in the next 20, 30 years. The most important thing right now is to start to think about it. We can't do this sort of thing overnight, but we do have to think about it. And we have to think about it in a mass kind of way. The trouble is, universities now just teach neoliberal rubbish. The think tanks of the world are actually trying to support capitalists. This is the first major crisis that has occurred in global capitalism that has produced absolutely no new ideas. The 1930s gave us Keynes and a different view of the state. The 1970s, although I hated it, gave us, you know, Milton Friedman and Hayek and supply-side economics and another view of the state. But this time around has produced nothing except let us continue the neoliberal project, because while capitalism is in trouble, the capitalist class is doing extremely well. The capitalist class has done better over the last 4 or 5 years than it did for the last 30 years before that. So the capitalist class is doing extremely well. The people are doing very poorly. And the big question to me is, when are the people going to rise up and say to the capitalist class, enough is enough. We are going to repossess the wealth that we have created. And we're going to repossess it because it does not really belong to you. It belongs collectively to all of humanity, and we want it to be used for all of humanity. Thanks very much.
Bem,